We reject any ideology or economic regime that puts profit before people, does not care for all creation, and privatizes those gifts of God meant for all.
How do I explain my theology? I grew up in a social gospel-loving church in a mainly atheist country, Canada, with the prosperity gospel infused throughout this culture of if you work hard, you earn more, you get more, and that's almost a gift from God. How do I have a conversation about what I believe and how I react to that culture, how I understand the stories of Jesus, with somebody whose context is so completely different than my own? If you grow up in a mainly Christian country, your relationship with atheism, with people who look for money all the time, is going to be a little bit different than mine. If you grew up in a Muslim majority country or a Buddhist majority country, as a Christian, that experience is a totally different thing. So when I say I'm a Christian and someone else says they're a Christian, well, we're not necessarily meaning the same thing. Well, we're both followers of Christ, but how we understand that to be lived out, what the commands of Jesus really mean to us today, are so different. How do I have that conversation with somebody who's just in such a completely different place? How do I explain how I think about ecology, how I understand the environment? I live in a medium-sized town in a national park in the Rocky Mountains of Canada. Nature is all around me. I can walk out my front door and within 5 minutes with my canoe be sitting in the river looking up at the mountains. Or in the other direction, it takes me about 10 minutes to walk to a mountain trail where I can hike to the top and look out over the valley and the trees and see the sky and the clouds and the rivers. Nature is just part of who I am. It's part of my everyday life. How do I explain that relationship to somebody who lives in a city, who lives in a big city? How do we have that conversation about what nature means when my understanding of nature is being able to walk out on a trail in the mountains and not see anybody for 3 hours and just have that one-on-one relationship? How do I explain that to somebody who will sit in a park under a tree but constantly be surrounded by people, by traffic? How do we talk about the economy? Money seems to be the last taboo subject, at least in Canada. Sex you can talk about at the dinner table, but even siblings often have trouble talking about money. How do we have a conversation in a faith-based way about economics, about what that means? And how do we even understand where each other is coming from? As a middle-class Canadian, so from a wealthy country, my understanding of what poverty is vastly different than people who live in other parts of the world. What I need to live is so very different as well. Being poor in Canada, the dollar figure is so vastly different than in parts of Southeast Asia. How do we reconcile that? How do we have a conversation about what that means? Economics is such a big deal. All of the religions of the world have said many things about economics. It's so important to our daily lives. So we have to have these conversations. But when what $5 is worth to me is different than to somebody else, what poor is, what that means is so different all over the world. How do we have that conversation? When I read a document like the Accra Confession, to me it speaks of a powerfully different vision of the world than the one I see around me. Is that the same for somebody who lives in a different context? To me, it speaks of how I need to change. Well, if you're not in one of those countries of power, do you feel that call to change as well? It can be hard to hear the words of the Accra Confession. How does that work? How do you do that? What does that mean? Are we going to hear it the same way? Is it a call to me? Is it a call to you? I mean, I know it's a call to everybody, but how do I deal with that? How does it affect me to know people who have been brought out of poverty due to the wealth generated by the oil sands in northern Alberta? What does that mean? How do I reconcile the environmental damage caused by the oil sands with the gifts that have been given to people, the livelihoods, the ability to give back, to give to charities, to be able to help other people due to the wealth that's been generated from there? How do I reconcile that economics with my love for the environment, for the ecology, for the world around me? How do I bring those things together? It's not an easy thing to understand what the gospel calls us to do, and to have it interpreted in another document in some ways sheds so much light, but at the same time makes that conversation a little bit more difficult. How do we have those conversations? How do we get through some of those barriers that exist? How do we have these conversations in a way where we can recognize where each other comes from? There are so many differences in how we understand the words we use, but we need to have these conversations. They are so important to our planet, to our souls. How do we have conversations where every word we use can have different meanings to the person using it? To me, it's one of the joys and challenges of theological dialogue, of dialogue itself. But we can do it. At least I think we can. As long as we do our best to explain, to not make assumptions, we can get somewhere. I believe we can. And these are conversations we need to have. The words of the Accra Confession, reading them again, they sound so true. There was something there. And in fact, words that I thought were so strong, potentially stronger than they needed to be 10 years ago, now sound pretty everyday. It amazes me the difference in how far we've come, and yet how true the words of the Accra Confession are. We need to keep looking at it. We need to keep building on it. And we can do it. I know we can. God depends on us doing so. The world depends on us doing so.